Hello, everyone. I'm Alan Willard, Senior Development Relations Technical Artist, and I'm going to be talking about materials today. The kind of framework that I've gone with is I'm going to rebuild a kind of volumetric style explosion that we did for our Showdown VR demo. I'm not going to try and replicate it exactly. It's kind of thing that you'll end up tuning very closely to where you're using it, but I am going to go over the basics of how we built it, some of the technical information about what it does, and then talk about other material tricks that you can apply and go to the forum questions and things like that from the live stream. So to get started, we've got the editor open in 4.8 here. And I've already dropped in a sphere into the world because that's what we're going to use as the base primitive for our explosion. And now we're going to start by creating a material. So just creating a new material, call it explosion test, because I'm really fantastic at naming things. And hitting enter will open that up. First thing we're going to do is we're going to move over and change it to unlit, because we're not going to have any lighting on this surface. And then we're going to add a noise module. Now, this noise doesn't start up with much useful data at first. The first thing we're going to do is preview it, so we'll see what it looks like. And you can see it's a very, very fine-grained noise. By default, it uses the pixel's position in the world. So it's basically a three-dimensional noise that's being shown on this surface. To change that a bit, we're going to change the scale down quite a bit. And at 0.025, you see, or 0.0025, you can start to see a lot of the detail. Now, this is a really nice noise function. The reason we don't use it a lot is because it's not cheap. If I turn on the stats, you can see, I'll go ahead and hook it up to the emissive and stop previewing. Just that node bumps it from 17 instructions to 109. So it's the kind of thing that we use sparingly and for specific reasons. So now that we've got this this simple noise, which you can already kind of start to see smoke in it, we can change the different types of noise that are being generated, and all of these have different costs. So setting it to per lin, we get fewer instructions, but less immediately apparent noise because the function is different. Changing the output min and max. So this is the value range that's output by the node. By default, it's -1 to 1. We're going to change this from 0 to 1, which will give us a softer looking smoke because we're not going into negative color values. So this isn't the kind of thing that you would necessarily need unless you're doing something like displacement where you want to displace inward as well as out. We can also achieve this by leaving the output at -1, adding 1 to it. So now whatever this is outputting is actually 0 to 2, and then either dividing by 2 or multiplying by 0.5. So now we should get something that is pretty close to what it looked like when it was in the 0 to 1 range, but it will have a little more fidelity because we're not just clipping off the lower values. We're actually getting the entire 0 to 1, or -1 to 1 expressed as 0 to 1. The reason doing this may be important is when you are displacing, if you do want it to go inwards, you'll need to still have that -1 to 1 range, but this gives you the entire thing in a positive value to use for your emissive color. So just to talk about that displacement a bit, I'm adding a vertex normal, and I'm also going to multiply this. So I'm going to take the output from the noise, multiply it up by some factor. Let's start with 4 to start with. And then we're going to multiply that again by this vertex normal. What this is going to do is take the existing surface and move it based on the noise sample that we're seeing. So feeding this directly into world position output, we're already starting to see some small amount of deformation. If we increase the multiply value, say to 16, you can start to see the surface of the sphere is getting quite a bit more noisy. I'm going to compile this and go ahead and apply it to my sphere in the world. And you can see it's getting some ridges and detail. And this is completely based on the smoke. Now, because we're doing this in the vertex domain, its resolution is limited by where vertices are on the actual mesh, which means if you have a very high frequency noise, but a low tessellated object with only a few verts, you're going to get some movement, but you're not going to get anywhere near the fidelity of the original object, or of the material that you're passing in. So there's two ways to go about fixing that. One is increase the tessellation of the object, which is pretty obvious, but comes at a cost. If you use that object in a lot of places, it's more triangles. You may end up rendering more than you particularly want to. The other is to do it, instead of in world position offset, doing it in world displacement. And that requires going back into the material, scrolling down to the tessellation, and turning on PN triangles is the best for curved surfaces because it actually kind of contours it with the spline. And then we're actually going to just move this by holding control and dragging it over. And now we have a lot more fidelity because it's now being tessellated and displaced on the GPU. So it's using the material much more closely and actually recontouring the surface to fit that. I'll go ahead and apply, and you'll see it update on the mesh in the world. And we can see there's a lot more detail here. Look at it from above so you can see the outline. So there's a lot more small, fine detail being expressed because the tessellation allows that to be visible. If I go into wireframe, you can see what the tessellation has done to the surface. The majority of the triangles you're seeing here didn't exist before. If I break this world displacement node and compile it, you'll see what the mesh looks like with just the tessellation and none of the displacement. Then, of course, if I turn off the displacement completely, this is what the mesh looked like before. So while it does have a fair number of triangles, it's nowhere near as tessellated as what we had with this feature enabled. So we'll turn that back on for now and hook it back up. So now we're going to talk a bit about blackbody. So blackbody is a way of expressing temperature as color. Physically speaking, the temperature range, I believe, is in Kelvin. So it's anything from 0, which is absolute cold, up to some ridiculously high number. It's the same values that are used for lighting. So when they talk about the color temperature of a light, it's literally that. The light is operating at a set temperature, which puts out a certain color of light. So we have a blackbody node in the editor that allows us to feed in a value range that gets output as a thermal gradient. So I'm going to use the output from that noise sample, and I'm going to linearly interpolate that from 0 to, let's say, 2500. And then I'm going to feed that into my blackbody, and then feed that into my emissive channel. And stop previewing. So I already have something that's starting to look like fire, because the whiter the noise sample is, the higher temperature it is, therefore the closer it is to being white hot, literally white hot in this case. If I increase this temperature range, say 4000, you're going to start seeing more of what looks like a roiling fire in there. And so this is the technique that we used for the showdown demo, to have a lot of those roiling flames in that the explosion that you saw there. Now the way we make this move is by manipulating the position of the noise. By default, it uses world position, so I'm going to drop one of those in. So here's absolute world position, which returns the point in space that any given pixel is on. And to start with, I'm going to mask out the red and green. So that's the XY plane. And I want the fireball to move upwards. I want to have things that are at the top move around the sides of the sphere and end up at the bottom. So the way I'll do that is by also masking out the blue channel, if I can grab the right pin. So I'm going to change the values here to turn off red and green and leave on blue. And then I'm going to add to this blue channel. So if we think of this as just a gradient, I'm going to move that gradient up using time. So I'll add in time, and I'm going to multiply it by 1 just to leave in a value that I'll need in a second. And connecting these together, I now have the ability to move the blue channel, or in world space Z, up and down based on time. So I'm going to append, which will reassemble the world coordinate. So I'm going to take the red and green, put those in A, so I now have red, green, nothing. And feeding this back in, I now have RGB. Feeding this into the position. It's moving, but it's moving very, very slowly. And that's why I left this multiply in. So if we take this multiply and set it to, say, 24, if I could type, there. So now it's moving at a better clip. You can see the almost smoky-like flame roiling underneath that surface. So this is giving me that moving fireball effect. Now here I'm setting it up in time. I could also set this up as a scalar parameter and drive this in a timeline externally. So if I wanted to have something that ramped up and down based on some external object, whether it's how far away the explosion is from you or things like that, I can easily set that up. So let's go and compile this and look at it in the world. So there we have our nicely tessellated roiling fire. If I increase this, let's say 100, we're going to get a really quickly moving fireball pushing its way down over the surface of this. And of course we can go in and increase our displacement. So that we have something really, really kind of noisy and following the contours of those flame balls. Now right now, because we're doing this all based on world space, what happens if I move the sphere? Well, it's going to do exactly what you would expect. As I move the sphere, this particular yellow stays in place in the world, but the sphere is moving around it. So I get this kind of moving popcorn effect. So to counteract that, in our world position, we're going to also get the actor position, which gives me the sphere or the material object, whatever it's applied to. It gives me that position in space, and I'm going to use that to bias around that value. So I'll hook these back up. And if I got my math right, which is questionable, not very good at math, willing to admit that. So now, wherever that sphere goes, it doesn't care. I'm counteracting its position in space with the world position. So it works really nicely for making sure that your effect will look correctly. It's still going to be subject to rotation. That takes a little more math than I'm willing to do, and scale. So you can get some really cool effects, almost like clouds, by just dropping this object in. But of course, the shader complexity, which is something that you need to always take into consideration, this is a more complex shader than just having an emissive texture panning over it instead of trying to do all of this world position stuff. So it doesn't look bad here, but when you add this with a bunch of other effects and real lighting in a real game environment, the cost can be a bit expensive. But it is still something that would not really be easy to accomplish in any other particular fashion. Another thing you can do is, obviously for this, I'm doing more of a fireball effect. If you want to do smoke cloud or just volumetric clouds in the sky, you could do variations of this, and instead of having time being your offset, have a scalar parameter that allows you to have kind of random samples for clouds and change the noise function, including things like the filter width, which by default is, I believe, 1. The filter width is how much it smooths the noise between samples. So now if I compile it, it's going to be a more kind of softer smoke, not as much coiling. But this, you could do clouds with this. You could do smoke trails, contour effects, explosions, pretty much anything you like by just playing around with these values and choosing where and when you're going to drive this type of behavior. Now, obviously, I've got this applied to a sphere. If you did something like a cylinder, I've got all my engine content here. If I drop this in, those of you who have seen the Showdown demo or have downloaded it, I believe it's available now, may have seen that we did rocket smoke trails. It's almost exactly the same effect. If I just applied this material to my cylinder, panning it in a different direction, you get that kind of panning smoke, and then we just have material properties that faded out as the rocket gets older, things like that. So we've got a couple of questions from the forums about different things that we've done and how we built some of this stuff. The first one I'm going to cover is whether or not this explosion is also going to include how we did it in Infiltrator. Infiltrator, during one of the action sequences, the hero character is climbing up this central screw with all the hovercraft moving around it, and there's an explosion coming up from below that starts to catch up to him as he gets into a maintenance shaft and escapes. That was done by processing all of that explosion behavior inside of Maya and then exporting it as basically frame slices that we played simultaneously. So if you think of it as being a number of layers of explosion all kind of stacked on top, and each layer is playing its own portion of the effect back, that's how we accomplished that, which worked very well for that, but is not a very practical way of building a game's worth of content. It worked very well for the cinematic, and it let us explore a lot of ideas of how to do something more filmically instead of kind of the just multiple frame animations that we typically use for game explosions. It's not how we've done the explosions in Showdown. It's also not something that I can really do here because it requires so many additional tools for generating the content. Francois, the artist who built all of that, I believe he's actually talked about it several times in relation to our Infiltrator content and how we built it. So I'd recommend, if you're interested in doing something like that where you want to integrate Maya into your pipeline for doing cinematic effects, looking online and finding some of the reference that we've already published on how we did that. Another about displacement was, how would I go about creating a shader with displacement that can be displaced by other objects? For example, the player creating footprints in snow and sand. This one's a little trickier because you can end up with a lot of overdraw issues if you're trying to do it all in a single shader. If you do it like the way that I've done the displacement here, you essentially either have to have a texture that you render for every footstep that you update, kind of like painting in footsteps, and then the final result of that paint is your displacement positions. So as your character walks, he's basically leaving little blobs in a texture. Those blobs are then used to push down the displacement for an entire surface, which we tend to avoid accumulating things like that in a rounder buffer because of the cost. It can be done. Another way would be to potentially do it in a blueprint where you have vertex deformation being done in the shader that takes in an external input. But again, you have to accommodate that number because the way the shaders work, you can only have so many effects like that going on simultaneously without kind of building the effect bigger and bigger. Most of the time when we do something like that, we use our decal system, which allows us to have kind of parallax offset effects inside of the decal that gets projected down. So as the character steps, we leave a decal behind. The decal looks like there's depth to the footprint. It modulates the lighting. It has a normal map that gives you that effect, and it lets the player think that what he's seeing is accurate footprints in the sand. There have been licensees and people who've done investigative work into doing real-time displacement where they actually move the verts in the vertex shader for the object, not the way I as an artist would do it. And I'm sure there are people out there who are quite a bit smarter than I am who do that kind of thing on a regular basis. However, the system as it currently stands doesn't really accommodate that unlimited number of influences the way you'd need to do a real-time footstep impact effect. There's another question of how would I go about creating a fake dynamic parameter for GPU particle materials in explosion effects since dynamic isn't supported? There's a couple of different ways. I'll go ahead and start creating a particle material. GPU random. So because GPU particles basically get spawned and then the material really never gets touched, you can't do things like dynamic parameter. If I were to do something where I wanted an almost random sample, let me find just a texture here. Texture. So I'm just going to find a noise texture here. So particle position world space gives you exactly that. It returns the particle's location in world space. You can then play around with these values. So for example, I'm just going to take the red channel and texture coordinate and add these together. So now wherever this particle moves along the x-axis in the world, this noise sample will get updated. Create a sphere mask just to not have a bunch of quads floating when I get to this. So again, the sphere mask that I'm creating here, given a texture coordinate and a value of 0.5, it will return a nice clean circle. By default, that looks like this. You can see each face is getting a circle. I'm going to go in and change the hardness, and that'll change how sharp this is. So now we have a linear gradient from the center out, so we get a nice soft circle. I'm going to use this as the opacity. We'll go ahead and multiply this by the particle color. There. So multiplying this by the particle colors alpha gives me an opacity, and we're going to multiply the noise texture by the RGB value. And into the emissive color. So now I have this noise sample is going to be modulated. If I preview this and then stop, go back and change it to be translucent and unlit. So now we have a somewhat effective particle effect. And then most likely we're going to want to divide this particle position by some relatively large number like 1024, because for every unit that it moves in the world, that would be the equivalent of a gradient that goes from 0 to 1, 0 to 1, 0 to 1 over and over again. So our offsets would move very, very rapidly. By dividing it like this, for every 1,024 units it moves, it will essentially scale one tile. So now I'm going to create a particle system. Call it GPU example. I'm going to use that particle effect that I just created, or the material, and set this to be GPU particles. So now, because the particles are all basically in the same location, they're going to get the same values. So I'm going to start moving them along X, and then change my scaling factor here. Watch this totally not work, and I'm going to look like a not bright person. There, you can see it. They're basically moving as they move down that vector. Slow this down. So you can see the particles are shifting their position. The material is shifting its position within that particle effect. Bringing that value down even further. I'll change how many times it will kind of proceed through a tile. You'll see it move even quicker. So the way I would normally use this is by having this look up into a noise texture, and then using that noise texture to offset the coordinates. So this gives me something that allows me to do randomized particle or pseudo-random particle behavior in a GPU particle system that doesn't really allow for that kind of dynamic parameter. You can also feed things like a gradient into particle time. The way a lot of GPU particle systems work is the value that you set in a curve gets evaluated down to a gradient, and that gradient is stored with the particle, and that gets expressed over time. So you end up with this compressed version of your curve that doesn't have to be evaluated every frame because it's just a linear expression stored as basically color. That would be doing exactly the same thing as what you could do in a material, where you use a gradient to define the amount of intensity some particular part of the material has on the final particle system. So are there plans to add vector displacement maps for terrain creation? You can actually do displacement on terrain and do it in a three-dimensional vector the same way I can do it in here. The problem is, because there's no collision, it's not really a good solution for that. We've discussed doing kind of three-dimensional terrain, but it's not something that's gotten past the discussion phase. It's something that we're interested in looking at going forward as time permits, but we do have a fairly full schedule, so it's not something that we anticipate going on the schedule in the near future. In trying to make a day-night cycle with visibility on mobile, I need a cheap way I can light things around my character and have this fade to black as it gets further away. How would you go about this? So there's a couple of different tricks you can use. One is to have if it depends a lot on your game type. If you're a top-down game, if you're a side scroller, there's a few different ways you can do it. One is to place a card in front of the camera that fades to black away from the center, and then keep that centered on your player as he moves around the scene, which wouldn't do things like raycast occlusion, where if I'm holding a torch and there's a box in front of me, the things on the other side of the box are in various amounts of shadow. But it would give you the ability to have a cheap darkening effect that moves with the player. The other would be to do something based on world position. So you take the position of the character, update that every frame, and actually use sphere mask to compare the position of the player versus the position in the world, and that will generate a gradient map away from the player that you can then use in your materials to control how well lit they are. Usually just modulate the diffuse, or if you're doing it all in unlit on mobile, you just modulate the emissive channel. And that would give you the pseudo lighting fall off that you're looking for. My noise node is outputting a really grainy shader. What were the options on this noise to get a larger and smoother output? So going back into the noise sample, so the things that I changed were I set the scale really small so that the roiling was larger in scale. I'm using Perlin. You can use Simplex. Again, this is going to give you different results. I prefer Perlin. Fast gradient, it's not too bad. you can see it gives a pretty good output, and it's a lot cheaper. And then the level scale, output min and max are all the default. But one of the things that I changed was the filter width. If I get rid of that, the output is a little crisper. So it really depends on these values, your scale, your function, and then the filter width. That's going to control the graininess or density of your smoke effect. How then will we create the disappearance of the effect of the fireball and immediately combustion smoke appears? So there's a couple different things. One is you could easily control the thermal output of the fireball by, before you get to the black body, I'll move all these nodes out a bit. If I drop in a lerp and a scalar value and say we're going to call this scalar value temperature override, and I'll set the value to 1. I'm going to, actually I don't even need the lerp, I can just multiply this. So now my thermal gradient here is being constrained by this override before it gets passed in. So with that compiled, we're going to create an instance of this so that we can control it really easily. And I'm going to find that sphere. If you're wondering what sphere it was I used, there's an arcade editor sphere that's got the tessellation that I was looking for this particular effect. So going back to my material, I'll drop the instance on there. And then inside the instance parameters, if I control that temperature override, we go up to some ridiculous values, but it allows me to go down, but the roiling stays there. I could also choose to lerp between the black body and, say, just grayscale. So going in here, I will instead lerp from there we go. So A is the black body result, B is just the smoke that eventually gets fed into the black body. And I'm going to skip over this multiply, and here we go. So now at 0 we have the black body results, and at 1 we have the smoke results. So I'll set the default to 0 and feed this into the emissive color. And now as I drag this around, it goes to just smoke. And obviously you could have this lerping between two completely different expressions of the smoke, or of the fireball. You could do one where it's more a softer noise pattern. So you go from very kind of crunchy fireball noise to softer kind of moving smoke. You could also do it so that your, look, we've got negative values. You could also do it so that you go to just a textural version. So if you have something like a really nice rendered smoke, you could switch to that. If I wanted to get rid of that that crunchy value, or the negative value, I could just clamp my override 0 to 1. Now, no matter how high a value I set it, it won't actually go above 1, and I'll get exactly what I was looking for. I could also take this and power it up a bit so that it's not just the straight RGB value that was coming from before. So there, now it's a little darker. So there's a lot of things you can do, because essentially when you're looking at what the smoke is doing, or the fireball is doing, it's just a range of values. If you feed that into the black body, amplified up to the right temperature range, you get fireball. If you lerp between different textures, you can have different types of smoke passing through each other. If you do it inside a displacement shader, you get the vertices moving around. One thing to keep in mind, though, is having one noise function is reasonable for certain effects. The more that you add, it's not sharing data, it's recalculating all that noise, so your cost is going to go up pretty dramatically. So the other way that you might want to do this is by fading this out in favor of having a second one inside. And there's a couple of different ways of doing that. None of them are particularly cheap. If you use the dither temporal AA, this will give you a screen space dither pattern, but it requires that you be in masked mode. And this is how we do a lot of kind of cheap translucency. So I'm going to do alpha threshold, feed this into this input. So I can fade it out in favor of having another one. So if I had a second smoke inside, I could fade this out and it would go to the darker smoke ball inside. How would you do a flashlight effect with materials? Only what the camera is looking at gets emissively lit. Not sure exactly what you're going for with that. If you wanted to do a flashlight effect with materials where you have essentially a cone that gets projected in front of you, and there's a lens effect, like the Fresnel distortion that you see in a real flashlight, then we would normally just use a dynamic spotlight with a light function on it. So a light function lets me have a material on a light that will show up on the spotlight in the world. So let's go back and find. This will work. So there, kind of noisy, but we'll fit that in. There's a bunch of other stuff you could do with like light vectors and things like that to make sure that this scaled based on distance from a surface and things like that, but we're just going to add a spotlight real quick. And inside of that spotlight's properties, we can set a light function, and you can already see that effect being projected by this spotlight. So now this would be, if you had a lens, a texture that looked like the distortion that you see in a spotlight lens, it would look like that as it moved through the world. Someone had mentioned in a prior stream about trouble with my water material. It doesn't appear in games sometimes, and dynamic shadows get down-res like crazy in quality. Any ideas? Unfortunately, not without seeing it. The water materials that I did, depending on which one you use, for example, the translucent one is driven by the blueprint, not just the materials. So if you place it in the world but don't have the blueprint to drive the proper settings for location offset, you could conceivably end up with some very unusual appearance in game. The displacement maps, the kind of ocean water one, depending on the amount of texture memory you're using, you may want to use lower resolution textures on the water, just because if you have a fixed texture budget and you have a high resolution but low importance texture, that texture is likely to only load lower mid levels if other things are using up texture memory. So I would recommend looking at that, seeing how much texture memory you're using. Without seeing what it actually looks like, it's kind of hard to diagnose. Looking through the how to create a blinking effect like an old TV. So depending on what specific effect you're talking about. We've actually done stuff like that in the past. Matter of fact, in the beginning of the Samaritan demo, there's a pan past like an old TV with the Unreal Engine logo flickering on it. There's a couple different things you might want to look at. One is obviously you've got scan lines are kind of the first component of a TV, and one of the ways you can do that is in your material, TV material. So let's say I want to have that scan line, and I don't want to do it in a texture. So I've got my vertical bar here. I can put that into a sine function. And then abs it. So now my sine period will define the number of bars on my TV. So if I just preview this ends up being my scanline function. So you can get greater or lesser fidelity based on how you set it up this way. So then if I just take a regular texture, find something reasonably graphic so you can tell. And multiply it. So we start getting that scanline look already. If you then start doing things like distortion, and I don't think there's a good example of what I'd need here, but so let's say we have a panner that's moving in Y at some clip. Then we're going to mask it. It's just green. We're going to do another sine wave here. But we're going to do it 1, and we're going to clamp it. So now we have a moving bar that we can use to offset the coordinates for this texture. So if we just append this back together, and then we're going to add it to texture coordinates. Oops, wrong one. So what I'm basically doing is saying this bar that I've generated by panning the coordinates, which gives me the motion. I only want the vertical gradient that you see here, but the sine gives me that rolling look. Then I'm clamping it instead of abs. So anything that's below 0, I just discard. So that gives me the on-off look here. And then I'm putting this back together as texture coordinates because I don't want to displace in 2 vectors. I only want to displace in 1. And then I'm going to add this like that. And now I've got that kind of the beginning of what would be a panning TV distortion, like you're losing sync. But because I'm not doing it after the scan lines, you can see the scan lines are still there, but I've got that panning distortion. Normally I'd do something that was more of a distortion texture that was getting panned in. Matter of fact, we could actually do it so that there's a little bit of noise to it by integrating this noise texture here before we put the thing back together. And now you get that kind of like a digital surf noise, like you're losing signal a bit. And then of course you can control how much of this passes through to the final value that you see here, and you might have multiple things as well. Another thing for a TV would be using that dithered noise. So this is giving you a screen space noise that you could then, rather than using in your opacity, use it in the emissive value. And now you're starting to get almost the phosphor dots inside of a TV. And you can go further and further with this. You could build something that occasionally lost vertical sync and move the entire frame up. You could do green screen by getting rid of the color here, feeding it in, and then playing around with the color values. So let's call this the TV color. We'll multiply this and then feed this into the emissive. And say we want kind of a Hercules green screen. So now we're looking at something like an old Apple display or something like that. All of this stuff you can do by just manipulating a few of the values in here. So now we have a really fine display. I'll get rid of the noise here. And power this by about 8. So now we've got a more clean distortion passing through. Might want to have this go a little faster. So now we've got something that's starting to vaguely look like it's lost sync. And you could easily have this be, part of a screen in a game environment, and it would look pretty good. Somebody asked if it's possible to create the flame effect radiating from the fireball. Yes, though you'd want to be careful because looking at the fireball, it doesn't actually have an effective surface, because when I've got that sphere in, the noise is going to put this all back together real quick. I think I'm going to have 2 spheres now. One was invisible. Yep. So all of this displacement that you're seeing is not something that you can easily take into consideration in your particle system. So when you do your particle effect on it, you kind of have to assume that your sphere is the original sphere, and then have enough particle placement noise to cover peaks and valleys in your displacement. So if I did a explosion particles, so now we've got a particle effect. If I just change this to have a sphere location, and we'll kill the original velocity, and I'll set it to be surface only. So now all of my particles will spawn on the skin of this invisible, almost imaginary sphere. Placing this in my scene, you can see the difference in scale is pretty dramatic. So what we would do is, for one thing, looking at the original sphere, it'll tell you the approximate size of the bounds, which gives you the diameter of the sphere. So we'll go back into the particle system now that we know it's 320. And half of 320 is 160. And since we're dealing with radius and not diameter, we now have an approximate equivalent size. We're going to change this to a GPU particle system just so we can have quite a lot of particles. And let's spawn, say, 2500. There. So now we have a sphere that is almost the same size as, let's find one that has been scaled up. So now just placing these two roughly on top of each other. Yeah, that's not noisy at all. Let's do it this way. Negative 300, negative 300, 300. We'll do the same thing with this. Negative 300, negative 300, 300. There. So our spheres are in roughly the same place, and you can see there's already a bit of a difference because the displacement of the fireball is protruding and falling within, so you see more and less of the kind of chaotic particles. So one thing you can do is a lot of these emitters stack, the emitter modules. So if I add a second sphere module, and the default is something like 10, no, 50. Let's change that to 10. And we'll reduce the other particle system, or the other sphere, to 155. We now have something that has enough noise in the surface to cover most of the peaks and valleys. Obviously, it's going to be dependent a lot on your material settings. You may want to have something that has a lot more, or do something where the particles have a slight velocity outward so that they're likely to cover their surface before they do something. So now they're kind of moving out, and if I were to find a fireball effect, let's just do this for now. And in the color over life, we're going to make it something roughly approaching a fire color. And then amplify this up a bit. And randomize the rotation. So now, rather quickly, we start to have a chia pet furred version of my fireball, but this starts to show you where you can start to get your fireball look. You could add more modules, like a little bit of acceleration in world space to go down. I don't have much in the way of fading or anything like that, but you start to get more of a kind of fireball looking thing without having to actually know what the underlying surface is. So that gives you kind of a starting point for building fire off of it. There's a couple other things you could do. You can make it a skeletal. You could make the fireball a skeletal mesh and then use the surface of that. But again, that would be the surface as it's given to the GPU, not as the GPU has processed it. So you're not going to have the displaced version of it. You're still going to have the original kind of perfect sphere or mesh. If you're doing this on something like a character, that would work as well. So something to keep in mind. So if we have any other last questions, I think we've got time for one or two. How would I make a water bubble effect? Very similar. You would do the explosion sphere. You could actually get something that roiled up quite nicely, because right now I'm compensating for the object's position. If you just spawn a mesh and have it move in world space and don't do that compensation, it will look like it's moving. You would just increase the amount of displacement quite a bit and do something that's more, let's do translucent, and let's make it default lit. We'll get rid of the emissive color, make it a base color 0.2. So we're starting to get some little bit of reflection there. We'll make it metallic just to make it really shiny. Yeah, it doesn't look that. Let's make it back. Let me make it plastic again. Bring this back down. And my displacement is a little high right now. And we're going to do Fresnel for the opacity. So this is going to break my other materials, but if you did something like this and had it moving through the world, you could start to get something that looks like a bubble. You'd probably want to use a cube map to get a nice kind of bubbly reflection off of it and play around with the Fresnel a little more. So the last question I see is, how would you make a translucent water puddle material to be applied to a mesh? If it's a static mesh in the world, a decal is the way to go. Do something that has a high reflection amount, maybe uses the screen position or the scene color and modulates that a bit so that you get something that darkens the thing under it. Looking at some of the decal content and examples would be a good place to start with that. So I think that pretty well covers it. Thank you everybody for coming and listening to me ramble, which I'm apparently proving that that's what I'm capable of. And I hope that it was entertaining and informative to anybody who sat through it. Thank you very much.